Squirrels! So hello, and welcome to another Legend of Runeterra video. My name is Chris, and today we will be going through part 2 of our ranking of all of the expansions in Legends of Runeterra. Today we'll be going through Call of the Mountain, Empires Ascended, and Beyond the Bandelwood. And if you haven't seen the first, where I go through all of the foundation sets and all of the Rising Tide set, and giving them a rating, then go and check those out. We split the foundations into each of the single regions, and obviously did Rising Tides as one. And today we'll be going through Call of the Mountain, Empires Ascended, and Beyond the Bandelwood as their sort of 1, 2, 3. Now, obviously, Beyond the Bandelwood only have the first version of that, the first little expansion side of it, but we will be going through that and obviously splitting it up into Call of the Mountain 1, 2, and 3, and Empires Ascended 1, 2, and 3. Quick reminder on things that we're looking for. We're looking at like champion design and, card design, like follower design and things like that. Is it thematic? Is it interesting? And I mean that both in terms of, is it interesting to play, but is it also just an interesting concept? My example for that is like Deep is quite an interesting, unique card game concept, and a very cool thematic one at that. So, things like that get more ratings, they get better scores for being interesting and being unique. And, do they have longevity? Are they still fun to play even long after they have come out? So, let's dive straight in, and we'll start with the Call of the Mountain first expansion. Unfortunately, there isn't a clear way for me in-game to split them up, into 1, 2, and 3. But, I will go through as best I can, talk about the champions as they came out in 1, 2, and 3. So, the first champion we need to talk about is Diana. And Diana and the whole Nightfall archetype was, I think, a pretty good success early on. It has somewhat fallen by the wayside since, but I do know that there are still people who very much enjoy Nightfall, and I think if it was just a little better, maybe even if just Pale Cascade got reverted back to what it was, that, Nightfall would once again be pretty popular. I think, they have tried to keep adding cards to this archetype. They just sprinkle in a card every now and again with Nightfall on it again, and I think that that's a pretty good sign that they want this to be somewhat popular as an archetype to play. I think Nightfall is kind of interesting as a design. I think it makes for more interesting gameplay than Daybreak, if I'm being honest, and I think it was definitely the more polished, the better of the two sides. Diana herself, is okay. Like, the quick attack challenger obviously does make sense, and that's pretty good, and getting extra attack as well does make sense, and I think a lot of the Nightfall deck was okay. My main gripe with Nightfall was that it felt like, there was two sides to Nightfall. There was kind of a mid-range side to Nightfall, which is kind of the Diana side, if you want, and then there's the aggressive side, which was more the Nocturn side. But my problem was with that is that they didn't really have a clear side for each region, because if they would have done that, would have given us more options to play. But for instance, a card like Crescent Guardian, is like a pretty aggressive card, and had this been like the Nightfall card rather than the Targon card, I think that would have made more sense, because of its aggressive nature. This is a very aggressive card, and I really do wish they would have gone kind of like all in on, like, for instance, Shadow Isles being the aggressive side of it and Targon being the mid-range side of it, so that we could get like a better sense of playing these champions, in kind of obviously the Nightfall deck, but then other options as well. So I'd give Diana, she doesn't see much play these days. She's kind of been outclassed. So I'll say Diana was okay. She was okay. Next we come on to Lulu, and Lulu obviously for a long time was completely unplayable, perhaps one of the worst champions in the entire game. But then recently, more and more, they buffed Lulu and they buffed Young Witch, and the whole support archetype just seemed to get very good very quick, in a very big sort of surprise, and Lulu ended up being one of the better champions. Now, that obviously only came after buffs, and so Lulu's initial design, I think, was a pretty big failure. They kind of didn't succeed in that. Support as a kind of, idea, and, really, obviously there were support cards in the game before, but kind of like going all in on support, and building champions around it was, I think, a pretty, good idea. Obviously we got 2 support champions, not to jump too far ahead, but obviously Tarik as well came out. I'm not sure if they were really wanted those champions to like fully synergize, but I think that there was definitely some hint that that's what they wanted, but that never really worked. And so, you know, Lulu has made sense. You know, again, there isn't really Ionia challenges, so it was always a bit odd. You know, Lulu doesn't work that well with her own region. Now, obviously, she has 2 regions, so perhaps she, you know, has more of a chance these days because of that. But certainly with Ionia, Lulu has always felt a bit off, and the support cards as well weren't great. And so, especially initially because of how underwhelming Lulu was, I do think that Lulu, whilst now she is okay, I think was a pretty big failure early on. And so yeah, not a great start here with Lulu. Next we have Leona, and Leona is one of the most confusing designs I think of any champion. Not based like on the actual champion itself, but just that she has like no other champion that supports her, and it seemed like there's plenty of opportunity, right? I'm sure a lot of people assumed that, particularly when Shurima was announced, that Shurima would have Daybreak cards coming with it, and that maybe one day will still be, you know, a possibility. But it just seemed like, why is there no other Daybreak card? You know, a lot of people complain about champions being cookie cutter and put with another champion, you know, that's the only deck you can play. But at least they have a deck. Like Leona kind of got left out in the cold, kind of with no deck, which is very, very odd. And also kind of weird because the rest of the Daybreak cards are actually pretty decent. You know, a lot of the Daybreak cards are perfectly fine, decent, strong cards in their own right, and they added a couple more later on as well, and, you know, they were pretty good. But Leona just doesn't really fit with it all. Like, Leona perhaps is one of the worst Daybreak cards, which is very odd. And yeah, because there's no like extra support, this is just an odd design choice. It's not even that the design is necessarily bad, it's just weird that like Leona kind of goes against everything else, you know, and every other kind of champion design of where they try and pair them together. And Leona was just there, kind of on her own. There is some synergies with the stuns that you can do, but it has never really worked out, and, you know, no one's really played Leona in a very, very long time. So overall, again, I think you'd have to probably say Leona, a bit of a failure. Next up, we have Nocturn, and obviously, as I mentioned before, the Nightfall thing, my problem with it was, you know, that it kind of had to be played together when I feel like there was a real potential that it wouldn't have to be played together. And I think it would have been much more interesting if it didn't have to be played fully together. Nocturn's design is okay. Again, I'd put this at a similar level to Diana, where, you know, it's just okay. It's nothing that special. It's fine. You know, it's just, it's okay. It's nothing that special, yeah. Nocturn, the whole Nightfall thing is fine. I know that some people like it, but I'm not going to go out and give them, you know, special medals for this design at all. Next up, we have Tarik, and Tarik is, as I mentioned, you know, we were going in on the support, and that kind of, you know, I don't mind that. That seemed like a neat idea for champions to have, and I think Tarik does have a really interesting, like, leveled up form. Obviously, Tarik has received multiple buffs at this point. I believe he came out as a 2/4. I think that's right, and then they made him a 3/4, and now they've made him a 3/5. I think that's what's happened. And again, the whole Tarik to me, it's somewhat reminiscent of Thresh. You know, if you watch the first part of this video, you'll remember me talking about Thresh and how Thresh, it wasn't really Thresh's fault that he wasn't seeing play, because he had to have another like card or champion to like pull out of the deck, and it wasn't until Nasus came along that really happened. And I feel like the same could be said of Tarik, but we're still actually waiting for Tarik's Nasus to come out. You know, we're still waiting for maybe a champion that Tarik can support, that if it can't die, I mean, maybe Fiora would be that, but Fiora had better options. I don't know. We need like a very specific thing to come out that Tarik can work with. Because at the moment, it just feels like, again, he's kind of interesting, and I'll give them points for Tarik being like an interesting design, but there's nothing really that like screams, do this with Tarik. Like, this is clearly what we want you to do with Tarik. It just kind of feels like, you know, okay, like, you know, it's fine. Like, there's always going to be slightly better things to do. Like, if you're targeting your allies a bunch, then why not just play like an elusive deck, you know, like Nami or something. rather than Tarik. So that, I think, is my big problem with Tarik. Again, okay, I'll give him some points for being interesting and kind of unique, but it's never really worked out. On to Trundle, and Trundle was a bit of a monster early on, pun intended. Obviously came out as a 4/6 and was just, with a 4/6 regeneration, just allowed you to stall this game out forever and ever and ever. And, you know, eventually Trundle would kind of win you the game, and obviously we had multiple decks run Trundle. Took a bit of time, I think, for people to figure out how strong Trundle was, but once they did, you know, and then Feel the Rush came out, and that really pushed Trundle over the edge. And obviously we still have seen Trundle pop up now and again, and I think anytime we will get like a Shadow Isles Failure control deck, the Trundle will be a pretty good option for those decks, particularly Feel the Rush, if that ever comes back in a big way. That Trundle will be kind of at the forefront because he levels up quite easy in that kind of deck, and having the Ice Pillar is quite nice, I think, in that deck. And so Trundle, you know, I think it's been a success overall. He's seen, you know, multiple different decks. He was obviously too strong to start with, but now I think he's in a good place, and it is kind of relevant, and it's just kind of waiting for like Shadow Isles Failure control to kind of come back. Or if there's like, you know, more like 8 cost synergy that comes out or something like that, you know, we'll get there. The whole troll thing didn't really work. And again, I kind of wish they made a tribe for trolls. I think that would have been better. But, you know, Trundle, overall, I would say, probably, honestly, the most successful so far of the champions we've looked at. And then we come to Aurelian Soul. And Aurelian Soul, of course, was really, really interesting when he first came out. Everyone was like mind blown. A 10-mana champion. Of course, the only one we've got to this day. And maybe, honestly, the only one we will ever get. But we'll see, I guess. You know, really interesting. The whole invoke thing. This massive, massive monster dragon. Just really interesting. Invoke as a mechanic is, you know, is fine, right? Like, it's, again, nothing like special. But having this massive dragon, you know, 10/10. And honestly, as a 10-mana champion, you know, at first I remember thinking about a 10-mana champion, like its level up literally needs to say win the game, but Aurelian Soul didn't, and so I was initially like, well, this card's going to be terrible. Honestly, Aurelian Soul surprised me a bit. It was a bit better than I thought, but obviously, and actually got a nerf. But now, again, we're kind of back to where we were, where people aren't really playing Aurelian Soul anymore, and there's better things to do, and yeah, probably honestly needs a buff again. But pretty cool design, you know, this big monster thing. I will give them credit for that, you know, this big space dragon. You know, the Sky's Descend is like a really funny, cool card as well, so I will give them some props for that, and obviously all the invoke cards were kind of interesting as well. So yeah, again, a pretty decent attempt, I think, overall. And so when we look through like some of the other cards that we obviously got like the Nightfall cards and like the Gem cards, and you know, we did get some pretty powerful cards coming out with this. You know, some of the support cards, obviously like Young Witch got buffed later on, but those are the kind of cards that we're looking at, like Nightfall, Daybreak, support. Obviously the like 8+ Behold cards came out as well, and we got some pretty decently powerful cards, like Troll Chant, for instance, as well coming. And Jack the Winner, which used to be a 5/6, which was a pretty nutty card when it came out. So, you know, we got some decent cards. Invoke, I think, you know, stuck around for a bit. But overall, when we look at this, like, you know, a lot of these champions came out pretty bad, and some of them stayed pretty bad. You know, you've got these 4 here in the middle that are kind of like, you know, especially when they first came out. Lulu now is fine, but when they first came out, you know, they were like, Nightfall was okay, Lulu was terrible, Leona has never really seen any play, like, you know, that wasn't great. Tarik, kind of similar, not seen much play. Trundle was really good at first, but then, you know, is okay, and like, there wasn't anything really that great about this expansion. And I remember Targon in particular, you know, people were kind of surprised that it came out pretty weak. And so overall, I think I'm going to give this expansion probably a 3 out of 10, because, you know, the champions weren't that great. We did get some strong cards, that some of which weren't even related, like Jack the Winner, for instance, or like, you know, Troll Chant isn't really that related to Trundle, if we're being honest. So, most of like the really impactful cards that we got weren't even sort of with the actual champion cards and didn't really enable the champions that much either. So yeah, not really a great first expansion for Call of the Mountain. Moving on to the second expansion, and this is where we got Soraka, Shyvana, and Tahm Kench. So let's talk about those. Soraka, and I guess we can include Tahm Kench in this as well, of course. I mean, they suffer from the same thing, which is a very limited deck pool. There are certain very niche things that you can do with each of them outside of playing them in a deck together. I do think the idea is pretty cool to have this damage deck and a healing deck and kind of, meshing them together. I do think that I like that idea and having the two sides of it and having the two sides represented very clearly. As I was saying, that kind of is what I wanted from the Nightfall decks, to be kind of two different things meshed together. So I do like that side of it, but I do wish there was more flexibility. And maybe down the line there will be, but as I'm speaking right now, there really isn't. So hopefully what we will see is, an improvement in the future. And this archetype has kind of fallen by the wayside because it's just getting no extra support. Even from like, when you get like one or two cards, not from that region. When that region doesn't have a champion coming out, you get an extra couple cards. Really none have been for this archetype of Tahm Kench and Soraka. And so whilst the design I think is pretty interesting and Starspring was like an interesting alt win condition, it's never really been like tier 1. It's always been a bit fringe. I don't think that many people really love playing this archetype either. I don't think it's one of the most popular archetypes out there. And so overall, between the two of them, I have to say probably a bit of a failure. And I think Tahm Kench as a character is really interesting. And I will say that he is very unique and the acquired taste and all that is really quite cool. But I do wish that, there was more to it. It feels like this character has a lot more to offer than is currently being shown. Tahm Kench, you just look at Tahm Kench, he's very different from every other character that's in the game currently, at least. And so, yeah, I do wish there was more to this, but unfortunately it seems like there is not. And so overall, I'd probably call them a bit underwhelming as well, both Soraka and Tahm Kench. And then finally we come to Shyvana, and Shyvana as well. Shit, I can't remember. They've changed Shyvana so many times that I actually can't remember what Shyvana initially was. But either way, she came out pretty weak. Now, some good dragon cards did come out, like Screeching Dragon. But there weren't too many of them, if I remember rightly. And things like Dragon Chow that really kind of helped this archetype didn't come out until later either. Dragons did see a brief like stint near the top. It's decent. It was pretty okay. And then like Eclipse Dragon, I think is it called, got buffed. And that was a pretty big help to dragons as a whole. But again, this whole archetype just shipped a bit weak. And if this was meant to be like the completion to Aurelian Soul, it didn't necessarily feel like that. It didn't give us that sense of a completed archetype that much. And so again, really not really the best, I think, design in terms of the champions. I mean, the Fury thing, okay, like Shyvana's design as a whole, pretty simple, like very Demacian, but pretty simple and pretty bland, and not that interesting. So overall, looking at like these three champions, we didn't really get much out of it. As I say, Shyvana really wasn't played early on, so we really only got one deck out of this expansion, which is a pretty big problem. I will give them some points for making Soraka and Tahm Kench, kind of unique and interesting. But really, that's about as far as it goes. And so we did get some interesting cards like Boxtopus, that saw play elsewhere and had some cool combos, but let's call this let's call it what it is. This is probably like a 4 out of 10. And then finally we come to the final expansion of Call of the Mountain, and thank the heavens that we got Zoe, because Zoe I would call perhaps the most successful champion design that has come in one of these smaller expansions. Zoe was so good in terms of every single thing. She was unique. She was a very good power level, like strong, but not like overpowered. And we've seen that because, nothing has changed about Zoe, and she's still pretty powerful and still pretty strong. but, you know, no one thinks that Zoe needs a nerf or, you know, anything like that. So just really cool. And also Zoe allowed you to do this really cool thing with her anytime she leveled up, you know, and allowed you to kind of go in for all in Zoe if you wanted to and really try and level her up and do some crazy things. Or you could just play Zoe in, you know, perhaps a more competitive way and kind of go for like, you know, just the pure value engine that Zoe is. I think that they knocked Zoe out of the park. Like literally 10 out of 10. Couldn't have been better. And considering the rest of this expansion as I've been talking about, this was a very welcome surprise because of course a lot of people first saw Zoe and, you know, didn't think Zoe was going to be very good at all. But then it turned out that, thank God, Zoe was a very big success. Next up is Riven, and Riven, yeah, it's kind of the opposite to Zoe, really, where a lot of people thought Riven was going to be insane, and then turned out not to be, and needed to get buffed instead. Now, Riven, you know, I do think it's a pretty interesting design for a champion, the whole Blade Fragment. I mean, it's kind of similar to Draven in a way, but the Blade of the Exile, I kind of like, you know, it's kind of cool. The whole Reforged thing is pretty cool. It kind of shipped a bit weak. You know, the Blade Squire came out as a 1-2, and that didn't really make any sense. And so, yeah, it wasn't great upon initial release. It got a bit better once the cards got buffed. And, you know, Riven is like, okay, you can do some cool different things with it, you know, whether it's Tarik Riven or, like, Draven Riven or, you know, even you know, some cool like Victor things, I guess, if you really want to do, or just a general mid-range game plan in, you know, just why not? And yeah, Riven's okay, right? I think she's a decent champion design, nothing like crazy special, but decent. I'll say that this was an okay attempt. You know, let's call this like maybe slightly above average. And then the third champion of that little expansion was Victor, and Victor, kind of a cool design. This artwork, I think, is perhaps the best. I'll just show it to you now. I think that this artwork is really cool. So they get maybe a point for that. Kind of an interesting design. Obviously, power level, again, a bit of an issue. Shipped a bit weak. I can't remember how they buffed him. Was it the level up they made easier? My big problem with Victor has always been that his leveled up form, your created cards costing one less, just has never really felt good enough. The character himself is okay. Like, you know, I kind of like, you know, the general idea behind it. As I say, the power level is perhaps the problem. The level up is a bit of a problem. The created card things is interesting. You know, that is an interesting design choice. It's just always been a bit slow. I mean, you know, Victor, as people have pointed out, is kind of like a bad Arsenal in the landmark decks, like, and you know, he's kind of like a Mountain Scryer in like Targon Allegiance decks. You know, he kind of does the same thing, and you have to level him up to get there. Augment is a pretty cool keyword, I'll give them that, and we've seen that kind of come around with the Darkness card. I can't remember the name of it. Is it Dark Bulb Acolyte or something like that? The 2-mana card, you know, they slapped Augment on that, and I think Augment is like a cool keyword to just put on certain cards. I think it's a really cool, like, unique idea. And so I liked Augment, but again, the power level wasn't there. Of course, Victor did ship with some good cards, like Ballistic Bot, obviously is a really good card, but the rest of his kind of cards that came with him really weren't quite there. And so Victor, overall, probably a bit of a failure. And so for the third Call of the Mountain set, we are going to go a bit higher. I think I'm going to go for a 6 out of 10, but that is mostly completely carried by Zoe. I think that without Zoe, again, we would be looking at that 3 to 4 range. But, you know, Zoe, again, is carrying here, doing a lot of heavy lifting for this this little mini expansion. So on to Empires of the Ascended, and the first champion we have to talk about is Azir, which is a very interesting one. Because Azir, obviously, when he first came out, I think everyone loved Azir, really. You know, really cool, really unique, had multiple decks to play in. Whether it was Lucian, whether it was Hecarim, whether it was Sundisk, the whole Sundisk level 3 champion idea, I think was, you know, really good. Even though, you know, Sundisk, you know, people want to see it buffed, and I think rightly so. But, you know, I think the idea was really cool, let's be real. People want to see it buffed because they care about it and they think it's a cool idea. So Azir as a whole, I must say, when initially coming out, great success. Great success, as Borat would say. But obviously then when Aurelian came out, we had some problems, and there were some power level problems. Of course, Azir did have to get nerfed. And that was a shame, but obviously very warranted. But I think overall a pretty good design for a champion. You know, he is pretty flexible. Obviously, the problem was kind of when Aurelia came out, it just got a bit absurd. But I do like the idea, and you know, I think it was a pretty good design, particularly when it first came out, right? Let me move on to Leblanc, and my god, did we all underestimate Leblanc, because we all just thought, Mystic Shot's a thing. But it turns out, you know, Leblanc stayed pretty good. Stayed good, and, you know, perhaps has been sort of overshadowed these days. You know, we don't see too much of a reputation deck. Leblanc might have found another home in Ashe Noxus, to be fair. And it kind of goes to show that, again, these simple designs, even though they are somewhat simple, doesn't mean that they're bad designs. And I do think that Leblanc, particularly after the 8-mana card that becomes a 6-mana card when you get Reputation, became a 5/5, and you could use Mirror Image on it to get another rally, because it's when summoned on that card. As soon as you could do that, I will say that Leblanc got a lot more interesting for me, because now there was kind of a cool combo that you could do that would help win you the game. And yeah, Leblanc, it's nothing special, but I think it's good, right? And I think these simple designs can be pretty good, you know, kind of similar to Darius, that when you just get it right with a pretty simple design, you know, and the power level is good enough, that you end up with a pretty decent champion. And that's what I would say for Leblanc. On to Lysandra, and again, pretty interesting. Now, Lysandra is kind of a cool design, if we're being honest. Now, I know that we all have PTSD from The Watcher, but if we just step back from sort of power level wise and just look at the design, really, really cool to have like this, you know, summon these big things, get this leveled up Lysandra that controls these big, massive things. And yeah, just a really, really cool idea, I think, as a whole. So, Lysandra, pretty good design, like just from a being interesting and unique kind of thing. Had multiple ways of playing her. Obviously, we saw the control deck with Trundle that eventually did become a bit of a problem, but obviously that got remedied eventually. But obviously we still have, and we still do have, the Frozen Thrall deck, you know, just summoning a bunch of big Frozen Thralls with Lysandra and Talia. So, just a really good, really cool, unique kind of design, and I think, yeah, good power level now. You know, and obviously the Watcher was a bit of a problem, and maybe they went a bit too hard on the Watcher, if we're being real. But overall, I think a pretty solid design. We move on to Renekton, and Renekton, oh, how I wanted you to be really good, but you just weren't. You just weren't, and it was always just a bit clunky. Now, I will say Renekton could be played in multiple decks. He was, I assume, intended for Shurima Demacia, is where they wanted Renekton to go. It ended up not being the case, and I think the main problem Renekton had was that Sliver is just better Renekton. You know, they both cost 4 mana. One has Overwhelm, one has Quick Attack and Spell Shield. You know, one is a 4/4, one is a 5/3, and it just ended up with one being better than the other. That's essentially all it was. And yeah, that's basically the problem with Renekton, right? That he's just been completely overshadowed by Sliver, and, you know, considering they came out in the same set, that's not a good thing to have at all. You know, perhaps it's that these champions weren't unique enough, and I think that that is a criticism that you could make. Personally, I would like to see Renekton's level up come down to 10. And honestly, I wouldn't even mind if, again, they just went simpler with Renekton. Forget this attack, just make him an 8/8. You know, just straight up, just let's make Renekton strong, you know? Do one of them at least. Again, the level 3, really interesting, pretty cool. But as a whole, I do wish that Renekton was, you know, just a bit better. Just maybe even just to distinguish himself from Sliver in some way. So overall, probably a bit of a failure for Renekton. Sliver, on the other hand, was not a failure. The Reputation deck came out and it was pretty strong, and then Sliver got buffed, and oh my god, Sliver became a massive problem. Obviously, in combination with cards like Ruin Runner and Merciless Hunter that we got a bit later, Sliver became just insanely broken. And I don't think there's much more else to say, really. Sliver, again, very simple design. But again, pulls off a very simple design. I do think she has a pretty interesting level up. Of course, she is too strong. Like, none of you need telling that. And so I wish, they would find a slightly better way of balancing Sliver. And, because she's so simple in design, it is quite hard to balance this card. Because I think even if they push the level up back, I think what was probably more likely is we were all just underestimating Sliver quite a bit. And now we all know the power of Quick Attack Spell Shield in combination with like vulnerable effects and the like. Really, really strong. And yeah, Sliver, I would say overall is a decent champion design. They got the power level. Well, they probably got the power level right to start with, but then they buffed it for no reason. So they probably had the power level right, but then they ended up buffing it, so maybe that's clouding my thinking. Pretty simple design, nothing like too crazy. So a decent attempt. Moving on to Kindred, and Kindred probably is the biggest failure of this expansion. Not only did Kindred ship as a failure, which to be fair, other champions did as well, but then Kindred has stayed a massive failure as well, whereas others have been buffed, like we'll move on to Talia in a minute. Yeah, Kindred just never really fit within their own deck. And so there isn't really much to say other than Kindred is a massive failure, because we all know that to be true. Talia, on the other hand, of course, shipped very weak, then slowly after like multiple buffs, eventually became pretty good, and now sees quite a bit of play. But, we must keep in mind that Talia shipped very, very weak. She, as well, like, there was Lysandra, but there was no, like, other landmark thing to really do, and Talia was seen as a true meme for a very long time, which is a bit of a shame. And so, to begin with, like, pretty bad, but then eventually, we got there, we found, we found our way with Talia, and we ended up with a champion that is worth playing. And so overall, let's call it even. Let's call it an okay design. Moving on to Jarvan, and similar could be said about Jarvan. Of course, shipped very weak. Even though a lot of people thought Jarvan was going to be very good, of course he was very weak. 6 mana 5/3. He actually got 1/1 of stats and his level up buff, so very significant buffs for Jarvan. And the whole burst speed attacking thing, pretty interesting, right? That's a pretty interesting kind of design, something we hadn't really seen before. Allies surviving strikes from any blockers, kind of very Demacian sort of feel to it, felt right, felt good. So all of that was pretty good. Jarvan's big problem was that, he was kind of, my initial reaction to Jarvan was that he was Lee Sin that couldn't get overwhelmed. And I think that kind of is Jarvan's problem, that he kind of is that, right? Like, he kills units for you, but that's it. He doesn't actually kind of punch through. And, to me, he is very reminiscent of if Lee Sin couldn't get overwhelmed, they both get the barrier as well. They both will sort of slowly chip away at your opponent, perhaps, and give you space for other units to get in some damage as well. But if Lee Sin couldn't get overwhelmed, he wouldn't be that good. And I think that is what's kind of Jarvan's problem. Like, sure, he'll slowly win you the game, but you could also do things that more quickly win you the game. And I think that's Jarvan's problem, if I'm being honest. And so, Jarvan, again, initially we have to call this a failure. It eventually got okay, so let's call it like, below average overall. Yeah, not the best. And then finally, Nasus is our last champion for the first part of this expansion. And Nasus, a champion that I think a lot of people vastly underrated, probably including myself, although I can't really remember. But of course, Nasus dominated this game for some time. Really interesting champion, that, again, somewhat simple design, but I think it is quite interesting, like getting the spell shield. Obviously, it worked really well with Atrocity. Getting this just massive unit, pretty interesting in and of itself. Having to slay things, the whole slaying thing worked very well with both Shreema and Shadow Isles. Fit the bill very well. And, unlike Kindred, was a centerpiece of the deck. And so Nasus, successful champion, not the most flexible. So, I'm not going to say this is amazing design or anything, but it's fine. And the Sun Disc is an extra deck that you can play Nasus in. And I do think Nasus is perhaps the strongest of the Ascended champions, which I don't think most people have realized yet. But Nasus, wins you the game on the spot, straight away. Whereas the others actually don't. Because Nasus gets 7/7 in stats. I don't know if people have realized this even yet, but Nasus, you have to have a 10/10, right? So he's at least a 17/17. And he has Fearsome and Spell Shield. And enemies have 3 less attack, which means that they probably can't really attack you. And also they need a 6 attack unit to even block Nasus, which most decks don't have. So Nasus will pretty much win you the game. But with that said, Nasus, yeah, pretty good, I would say, overall. And so overall for this first Empire Ascended, we've got kind of no major successes, but quite a few different successes. I would call Azir, LeBlanc, and Lissandra all successes in their own right. And maybe one major failure in Kindred, and the rest are kind of, okay. So I think overall that leads me to kind of going for maybe a 5 or 6, let's call it a 6 out of 10, I think, overall for Empires Ascended Part 1. So moving on to Part 2, and we begin with Zillion. Now, Zillion obviously kind of was shipped on his own, with kind of no partner, and we had to wait for Echo to come out. But Zillion is fine. I think people underestimated Zillion for quite a while, but he is okay. And now that more sort of landmark things have come out, I think people, have recognized Zillion as getting better. But the predict thing never really came together. He's kind of unique in a sense. The time bombs are pretty interesting, I guess. He's okay, nothing special. I would call him just average, very average in terms of his design. And of course, he did come out kind of with no real support, so you couldn't really play Zillion for quite some time. And we had to wait a while, so maybe even slightly below average overall. Then we move on to Aurelia, and the complete opposite is true here, where there was one deck very much that you wanted to play, and was one of the most broken decks in the history of the game for some time, and eventually a lot of those cards had to get nerfed. We kind of had to go through 2 rounds of nerfs for that deck because it was so strong, and now Aurelia, though, kind of is starting to fade from existing. And unfortunately for Aurelia, unlike Azir, there really is only one deck for Aurelia. There isn't that kind of synergy that she has with other things as well. I mean, maybe Misfortune if you squint really hard, but there isn't that much to be doing outside of Aurelia Azir. And so considering how wrong they got the power level with these cards and how broken the deck was, and the fact there isn't that much synergy, the design itself is okay. Blade Dance is not that interesting, if I'm being honest. It's just different things that attack. It's not that really that interesting. So overall, I'd call this not great design either. And obviously them getting the power level so wrong is a big part of that. And then the final one that we got in stage 2 of Empires Ascended was Malphite. And Malphite, again, not a great success at all, really. Didn't really see much play, still hasn't to this day. 7-mana champion that kind of, doesn't win you the game pretty quick is never going to be that great. And so, yeah. That wasn't the Targon landmarks are atrocious, so there really isn't too much to say other than a pretty big failure. And that means that for part 2 of Empires Ascended, we have to be looking at a pretty low score here overall. Honestly, I would say this is maybe the worst. I might give this a 2 out of 10. Zillion, we didn't really see anything from him. Aurelia, broke the game. And Malphite, we still really haven't seen any of Malphite either, so all pretty bad. So I'm actually going to give this a 2 out of 10. Now we come to the final parts of Empire Ascended, and that is obviously our Lurk and Echo. So let's begin with Rek'Sai. Now Rek'Sai, I think Lurk as a mechanic was perhaps better and a bit more interesting and nuanced than people initially thought. It is quite interesting. I think Lurk is, you know, better than people think as well in general. And it's a pretty powerful deck. And Rek'Sai is obviously a big part of that. You know, luckily for these two Lurk champions, at least they do go in the Lurk deck. Obviously, they are a bit sort of one-dimensional in the decks that you can play them in. I will say that Rek'Sai, it is possible, and I have done it, and it is quite fun to play Rek'Sai in a deck where you just aim to level up Rek'Sai as quick as you can with combat tricks, you know, like giving him, like, for instance, Thorned Blade with Rek'Sai. If you attack on turn 4 with a Thorned Blade on Rek'Sai and hit Lurk, that is 10 straight away. You know, Rek'Sai will give you 2 from the Lurk and the attack, and the Thorned Blade will give you 5, and so that will give you straight up 10, and you'll get 3 cards in hand, and you'll have this, you know, pretty big overwhelm unit on the board that your opponent is probably going to struggle to deal with. Sure, it's not the most consistent deck, but it is quite fun, and there are multiple things you can do with Rek'Sai, but it is still pretty limited. So overall, let's call this like okay design, nothing too special. Echo, obviously power level wise, completely wrong, too weak. Echo, I think, you know, from what I know of Echo, is quite an interesting character. The thing that I've always struggled with Echo is that he just doesn't feel like a Piltover and Zorn champion. Like, you know, he's all about rallying and reviving things. Like, this feels like a Lucian effect. Like, what is going on? Like, I don't know, like free attacks and things like that. It just doesn't feel very Piltover and Zorn. And there's a lot of different things they could have done with this. You know, it didn't have to be a rally effect. Reviving all that, it just isn't very Piltover and Zorn at all. And I understand that champions can kind of break away from their region a bit, but this feels so out of place. And I think that that's a big part that's holding Echo back. You know, if this was Demacia, this would be pretty good. If Echo was a Demacian champion, he'd be pretty good. You know, you might need to get rid of the predict then draw, because that's the thing. This is very Piltover and Zorn. This isn't. But this is the part that, like, you're playing for the level. It just doesn't make that much sense in a lot of ways. And I don't really know what they were going for. And it doesn't, like, you know, why would you want to, like, Zillion is your other champion in this deck. Like, you don't want to revive Zillion. Like, why are we rallying with Zillion? That's not the way he wants to win. Like, do you get what I mean? Where it just all feels a bit odd. It just all feels a bit odd and off and very confusing as a design. And having to predict 5 times when there's barely any predict in Piltover and Zorn as well. You know, I've said this before, but Zillion and Echo would do much better if they were swapped in the regions that they were. You know, Zillion's level up is a very Piltover and Zorn. You know, these words, fleeting, non-fleeting, creating, like, these are all very Piltover and Zorn. Time bombs, drawing, you know, dealing 1 to enemies in the enemy nexus. All very Piltover and Zorn things going on there. Echo, we've got kind of rallies for, like, mid-range decks and reviving things. So you can picture a deck, a Shurima deck, where, you know, things are getting vulnerable and you're trading with them, and then you're using this and then attacking with, like, your Merciless Hunters and Ruin Runners and things like that. Makes sense. But not in Piltover and Zorn, it doesn't. And that's the weird thing. And you also don't have enough predicts within Piltover and Zorn. So it's all just a big mess, this thing. And so Echo overall, I have to say, is pretty bad, both in terms of power level and just for not making that much sense in that region. And finally, Pike. And Pike is one of those where I just wish, I do really wish, that there was some way of playing Pike outside of Lurk. Because unlike Rek'Sai, where, like, as I say, if you squint, you could maybe can. With Pike, it seems not. And I think that's to do with the level up, right? That you have to hit the Pike, Lurk, transform, have enough Lurk, though, to get his attack high enough to deal the 15 damage. Because the problem is that just doesn't happen enough. Like, there's no way you can get 15 damage on Pike without being in a Lurk deck. And that's the real problem, because his level up is really interesting. You know, his level up could be a really strong ability in plenty of other decks, and could have given us this really cool, like, Bilgewater control shell that we hadn't really seen before. But no, because it only really works with Lurk. And that's really quite annoying and frustrating. And I do wish that that wasn't the case, but it is. So overall, Pike, not a bad design, but again, very limited. And so, considering these 3 champions, considering we only really got 1 deck out of it, I'd have to, again, give this expansion probably really only a 4 out of 10. I do think they could have done better with this. And finally, last but not least, we come to Beyond the Bandelwood and obviously our latest expansion, and we will talk about the newest cards. So, let us begin with Caitlyn. And Caitlyn, is okay. I do think that Caitlyn, hasn't quite fit where people would have expected her to. She's okay. The flash bomb traps, are a bit RNG and they're a bit kind of like, they can win you games. As Alan knows, Alan's Hugh, if you've watched the World Championships, we know that they can win you games on the spot sometimes. They can also just like lose you games, or if your opponent doesn't draw them. And she doesn't work that well with Teemo, I don't think. I think people playing Caitlyn Teemo are playing it wrong. And so she doesn't really fit that. So she's kind of a bit of an... She's okay, right? Like the idea of traps as a whole, I think are really cool, interesting designs of putting things in your opponent's deck and then being negative effects for them for drawing cards. Love that. Think that's a really cool idea. This execution, I think, could have been a bit better. I think it would have been better if Caitlyn's support cards were a bit better. Because at the moment, it does just feel like you play Caitlyn. And that's kind of your only real way of getting flash bombs in the deck. And that means that, she probably isn't leveling up unless you're playing with Teemo, but there isn't that much reason to play with Teemo. You get what I mean, right? Where it's just like we could use with like just one other really strong way of getting the flash bomb traps into the deck. Even something as simple as making the Sting Officer a 1/2. If this was a 1/2 instead, I think it would actually be a much better card. Because obviously it would survive a lot more, and so, get flash bombs into the deck. And also top 10 feels like a bit too much. Could we not make it top 8, maybe even, 2 in the top 10? Like, I could put 2 on the 10th card. Like, this game might not get to their 10th card. So I might never see that. Particularly on, like, turn 3. Like, if it's the 10th card and it's the 13th card down, we aren't getting there. They're not getting there. So, yeah. Could we not make that a bit smaller? I do wish there was small tweaks to Caitlyn that could make her, like, a bit more viable and make the level up more relevant as well. Nami obviously has come out and is just completely busted in like one deck and one deck only. She's like potentially just game breaking in one deck. So I don't think that's a good design. Like, she's not even really that flexible because whilst you can play her in a lot of decks, there's no reason to because she's so game warping in one deck that why would you ever even attempt to do so? And so I think that, again, while she is quite interesting in design and she allows you to do pretty unique, interesting things, right now, as we speak, there's a pretty big problem. She's way too broken. Tristana is a bit of a weird one because Tristana doesn't really have a deck and doesn't really make that much sense right now. Now, she might do in the future as more multi-region cards come into the game, particularly outside of Bandle City. If we start getting like, Freljord Bilgewater cards and all the different combinations, then she might be more interesting to play because then there'll be a lot more things to do with Tristana. But right now, there really isn't much to do with her, and it's kind of weird that she isn't dual region, when like others are, considering she's the multi-region champion, I don't know. It just feels a bit weird. And it's not that she's like completely terrible, but like, yeah, she just doesn't make much sense right now. There just isn't enough dual region cards right now. So I think it would have just been better if they would have just shipped Tristana like in the last version of this set. Because then there would already be like a bunch of multi-region cards and we would already have a good idea of, where Tristana could fit. And that to me would make a lot more sense than where we currently are. Ziggs as a champion I think is okay in a design. I do like the whole destroying landmarks. I think that that's a really cool like level up. Kind of a weird one, because obviously Ziggs and Xerath have the same level up condition. So you'd think that, they were designed to go together, but they really don't. But they have enabled other champions. Ziggs obviously goes better with Talia, and Xerath kind of goes better with Zillion, which is really good for both those champions because perhaps they were figuring out a home, although Ziggs also kind of goes with Poppy, but then again, everything goes with Poppy. So, Ziggs, I mean, the effect is, kind of like Misfortunes, I guess, but like on a lower level. So it's not really that interesting, I guess, as a whole. The landmark thing is kind of interesting. I do like it, you know, I've built like a Ziggs safety inspector deck, which I do really love. You know, when you've just got Ziggs there and you're using it for like this effect, when allied landmark is destroyed, deal 2 to the enemy nexus. I think that that's a really cool thing, that Ziggs can just sit there and like just start dealing massive amounts of damage to the enemy nexus. I really do like that. But, you know, Ziggs at the moment is pretty much being played as a 3-mana 3/4 that deals damage to the enemy nexus reliably, which isn't the best. But I don't think it's a bad design. I think overall it's a pretty good design. Poppy is, of course, insanely good. And unlike Nami, where, you know, Nami's good in one deck, Poppy is good in pretty much any deck. Any kind of aggressive deck could be improved by just putting this card in, because she's just really, really strong. And I don't love these champions, as I've said in the last video, champions like Draven, where they're just level 1 is insanely strong and that you don't really ever see them leveled up. Poppy sometimes will level up and then win you the game. Like, you were probably close to winning the game anyway, and then, you know, Poppy will just make sure that you win the game instead when she levels up. But I don't even know how they would change Poppy, if I'm being honest. She's just insanely strong, and so, yeah. It's an okay design. Well, it's a bit boring. I mean, it's a Damascene champion, of course it's going to be a bit boring, but yeah, it's okay, I guess. I think they could have done more with Poppy, if I'm being honest. Okay, we come to Vega, Vinegar, and Darkness. And Darkness, of course, kind of interesting, and is the first kind of, you know, if you go back and you think about it, it's kind of the first control, like really, really like hard control champion, and control, like especially two champions together with both Senna and Veigar. Like, it's the first time we've got a pair of control champions, like ever, maybe. Like, it's been a very long time since Control have had, you know, representation in this game. And so that's straight up a positive. Now, Darkness as an idea, I think I like it. You know, it's kind of a cool idea. I like that he, you know, his level up is like the clear win condition, you know, that you have to level him up to get the win condition. This all suits exactly, you know, he helps you. Everything about this is what I like in champion design. Pretty much every single thing about it. And so, yeah, overall, pretty happy with Veigar, however you say it. I think it's a pretty good champion design as a whole. And, you know, Darkness, there are definitely those who really do enjoy playing Darkness, so that's a very good thing as well. Moving on to Xerath, and yeah, as I said, kind of similar to Ziggs, right? Like, he enables those other champions, like Zillion in this case, to be played. And again, kind of a control-y champion, right? And also works very well with the Sun Disc. I think is the best Sun Disc champion to be playing, because he helps you get to the point where Sun Disc will actually count all the way down, which I think is pretty important. You know, we got good landmark cards. I think that's always a kind of point that people don't bring up enough when talking about champions, is that if their support cards are good, they will be better. You know, I talked about it with Caitlyn, that I do wish that more of her support cards were good. Xerath did get some good support cards that came with him, and there were already some cards that worked pretty well, like the Rock Opera and the like, that worked pretty well with Xerath. And so, yeah, a champion that you want to level up, that you will often level up, that will help you win the game through that level up, is always a good thing for me. Obviously, there is some limitations with how many different decks you can play Xerath in. But as a whole, I think a very successful design. Moving on to Senna, obviously the other side of Darkness, and yeah, again, a pretty good attempt. Has perhaps a more interesting effect, you know, a more flexible effect that you can play in many different decks. So that's a good thing, I think, off the start. You know, accelerating slow speed spells to fast obviously works pretty well with Darkness. It was a pretty cool idea. One thing that I think happened with quite a few of the different champions is things like this, where the champion spells themselves are pretty bad, but when they are champion spells, they are pretty good. You know, Senna giving you like a fast speed vengeance that's even better is really quite good as a champion spell, but as a non-champion spell, it's not that good, right? So really cool design, and they did that with a couple of the champions. So yeah, really cool, good design, again, very solid, very good. And finally, your boy Sound. And Scion, obviously, some people think is a little bit too strong, but I think that this is what 7+ mana champions should be. They should be winning you the game. You know, this is the problem. This is the reason you don't see a Malphite or a Trundle. It's because they aren't winning you the game, whereas Scion is going to win you the game. You know, I think that this is going forward what we will see more and more from these higher cost champions. You know, you have to give yourself a reason to play them. The fact that you can discard this card and it will do something for you. This is what I think that they realized. You know, this is clear to me that the devs have seen what big mana champions should be. You don't want to draw multiple of them. So having them be discarded and you actually get a good effect from it, that's good design. You know, because that makes this card a lot more playable. The fact that when it levels up, it's winning you the game. That makes this card a lot more playable. And for these big mana champions, you don't see many of them in Legends of Runeterra, but this is the way that you make them see play, is by making them, you know, both win conditions and also so that they don't just clog up your hand and so that you can actually discard them. Very, very, very good overall. Another thing I will say is that there were plenty of good, unique, interesting cards that came out in the expansion. You know, plenty of really cool designs. You know, I mean, just here in these 3 cards alone, you know, are really like some really cool ideas. You know, pranks I thought are a pretty cool idea. Something that we hadn't seen before. Obviously, the power level of some of these cards might be a bit too high, you know, and some might be frustrating to play against, like Minimorph. But I think overall, you know, even cards like Catalog of Regrets, plenty of cool, unique, interesting designs in here. Obviously, Bandeltree as an alt win condition, you know, is pretty cool as well. So just overall, I would say that like the extra cards as a part of that set, really, really, really great as well. So overall, I think what I'm going to give for this expansion is probably... Ooh, this is a close one. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I do think that this has been a very successful, strong, very good expansion on the whole. There are some things that I think, you know, have been a bit of a problem. The power levels of some of the champions might be a bit too high. There have been some cards as well that came that might be a bit too, you know, powerful. But overall, I would say a pretty big success for this latest expansion. An 8 out of 10 from me. And so here are all of the ratings for all the expansions. Of course, in part 1, we went through each of the regions of the initial set. And then we did Rising Tides. Call of the Mountain here split up into 1, 2, and 3. Empire's Descended is split into 1, 2, and 3. And then Beyond the Bandelwood here. So you can see we kind of started off pretty decent. You know, the initial sets had some problems here, but some of the regions I thought were pretty good. Rising Tides came in, and I think a lot of people would agree with me there. The Rising Tides came in and just hit it out of the park and went nuts and was really, really good. Then Call of the Mountain is where the game sort of started to fade a bit. The expansions weren't making that much of an impact, it felt like, on the game. And, you know, balance patches seemed to be more of what was determining what was good. And so we had a real lull there for some time. To be fair, the KDA expansion did change things a bit more, and I didn't really include that. So, you know, you could include that if you wanted to. So yeah, not amazing for Call of the Mountain. Then came Empire's Descended, and it started off okay, I would say. You know, it started off with some neat new things to do. Obviously, we got quite a lot of champions, so, you know, it's always going to be more interesting. But then the rest of the time, and again, I think a lot of people would probably agree that towards the end of Empire's Ascended, like, things were getting pretty stale. And I think, again, we got lucky that we got the Akshan Viego release. That kind of helped. That kind of helped with things as a whole. And helped keep things a bit more fresh at least. And of course we got a very big balance patch as well at one point, which again helped quite a lot. But without that, the game was really, really struggling. And of course we're only rating the expansions here. But then Beyond the Bandelwood has come out, and we did get, you know, some balance patches as well, some balance changes, but, you know, not too much in that hotfix. But there's still a lot of interesting, cool things to be doing. So that gets an 8, and hopefully that means that, you know, we're back on the peak, and, you know, the design space will, you know, continue to get better, and we'll keep getting 8s and 9s and maybe even a 10, and then we'll all be, of course, very, very happy. But those are my ratings. Really interested to see what people have to say about these ratings. You know, I'm sure there's probably at least one expansion that you can look at and disagree with me pretty heavily with, and I'd be interesting to hear your reasonings why. You've heard me speak now for quite some time. So thank you so much if you have watched through both of these videos. Of course, kind of like podcasts in a way, you know, about the game. But this was really quite a lot of fun to do. So please let me know if you enjoy this kind of thing and would want to see sort of more of this kind of thing. Because, yeah, although it did take me a very long time, it was quite interesting to do. So enjoy it. And yeah, I will see you tomorrow with more Legends of Runeterra content.